It was a morning like any other in the remote highlands of British Columbia. Mist clinging to the mountain pines, the air fresh and sharp, and the forest floor humming softly under the weight of dew. Naturalist and wildlife rehabilitator Miriam Clark had begun her routine as she always did. A hot cup of coffee, worn boots laced tightly, and a quiet trek toward the glade where a network of trail cameras captured the subtle comings and goings of elusive forest inhabitants. For years, Miriam had dedicated herself to observing wildlife with as little interference as possible. She believed deeply in the power of patience, in the unspoken bond that forms when one respects nature's rhythms rather than disrupting them. And today, without warning, her faith in that quiet relationship would be both tested and affirmed in a way she never imagined. She had first noticed the female cougar, whom she'd named Celine, almost 4 years ago. At the time, Selene had been just a lanky young cat, cautious and rarely seen. Most sightings were fleeting shadows on the periphery of trail cam footage. But Miriam, with her gift for recognizing individual animal behavior, began to notice patterns. Selene was different. She didn't bolt at every sound. She watched. She lingered. Over the years, Miriam would occasionally spot her in person, always at a respectful distance, always with no sudden movements. They shared an unspoken truce, a kind of reverence for one another. Miriam never attempted to feed or lure her closer. She just existed near her, silently. Then, one spring, Selene vanished from the footage. Months passed, and not a trace. Miriam feared the worst. A fight with a male, a territorial skirmish, perhaps even a poacher. The pain of uncertainty gnawed at her, but she carried on, scanning the trees each morning, whispering reassurances to no one. Then, just as suddenly as she had disappeared, Selene returned, this time with 2 cubs in tow. They were awkward, clumsy, and wide-eyed, trailing their mother with both excitement and trepidation. The sight had made Miriam drop her thermos that day, and what happened next would leave her even more shaken. Selene, rather than hurrying the cubs into the underbrush at the sight of Miriam, stopped. She stared at the woman from across the clearing, her tail twitching, ears forward. Miriam stood frozen. Selene gave a soft chuff, looked back at her cubs, then continued down the ridge. Almost casually, it was as though she had wanted Miriam to see them, to know she was alive, and that she had survived. Miriam didn't speak of it to anyone for a long time. She feared no one would believe her, or worse, that people would seek Selene out and break the fragile trust they had built. Over the following months, something even more extraordinary unfolded. Selene began appearing closer to Miriam's cabin, not often, and never without a reason. Sometimes it was just a glance from a thicket as Miriam watered the vegetable beds. Sometimes it was a rustle of leaves as Selene passed by while Miriam was hanging laundry on the line. The cubs, however, were growing curious. One day, while Miriam was fixing the wire fence near the edge of her property, a small, golden-tufted face peered out from the bushes not 20 feet away. A cub. Then another. Miriam froze, heart thudding. Selene wasn't visible, but she was undoubtedly close. The cubs watched her for a few long seconds, then padded back into the foliage. Miriam exhaled slowly, her hands trembling. She wasn't foolish. She knew wild animals are unpredictable, especially when young are involved. But something deeper than fear rooted her in place. It was awe, reverence. The next few weeks were surreal. The cubs appeared more frequently, each time coming a little closer, never crossing the invisible boundary Miriam instinctively knew not to violate. Celine watched from a distance, but didn't intervene. It was as though the cougar had chosen her, trusted her, and was now teaching her young to do the same. Then, late one evening, a storm rolled through the mountains. Lightning cracked like bones breaking in the sky, and thunder chased it down the ridgelines. Miriam stayed up late, worried for the animals in the forest. Near midnight, a sharp knock sounded at her back door. Not a hand, but something heavy, brushing the wood. She opened the door cautiously, flashlight in hand. And there, in the downpour, was Celine. Alone. She was soaked, her coat matted with rain, her eyes wide, not with fear, but urgency. Miriam's instinct was to back away, to shut the door, but Celine didn't advance. Instead, she turned and looked toward the tree line, then back at Miriam. She chuffed, low and hoarse, then turned again and walked a few steps into the dark. It was an invitation. Miriam grabbed her coat and followed, at a safe distance. The forest was muddy, slick and loud with the sound of falling water. Celine led her about a quarter-mile into the woods, to a gully she hadn't visited in years. And there, just beneath a fallen cedar, were the cubs. One was limping badly, the other shivering. Celine stepped aside, watching Miriam closely, heart hammering. Miriam crouched slowly and whispered to the cubs. She didn't touch them, just murmured calming words, assessing. The limping one had likely twisted its leg in the slippery terrain. Miriam gently set down her coat and placed it near the cubs, then stood and looked back at Celine. "I'll help," she whispered. And remarkably, Celine allowed it. It took hours, gentle coaxing, and every ounce of Miriam's experience in animal handling. But by dawn, she had managed to lead the cubs, Celine watching closely, back to the edge of her cabin, where she had a covered animal enclosure used in rehabilitation cases. There, dry hay, water, and calm settled them. Celine sat just beyond, the trees, silent, unmoving. For 3 days, Miriam tended to the cubs. She never caged them, never touched them unless absolutely necessary. She kept her movements slow, her voice soft. Celine came each morning and each night, watching through the fence. On the 4th day, the injured cub stood without limping, and on the 5th, Celine walked boldly to the gate as the sun rose and waited. Miriam opened the enclosure, heart clenched, unsure what would happen. But Celine simply gave a short growl, and the cubs followed her. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. That day, as Miriam stood watching the 3 disappear into the trees, she finally allowed herself to weep, not from fear or relief, but from the profound understanding that something had changed forever. She had seen it with her own eyes. Even a predator, bred by nature to be cautious, solitary, and fiercely protective, had chosen to trust a human, not because of dominance or food, but because of gentleness, consistency, and respect. News of the encounter eventually spread, though Miriam never publicized it herself. A few fellow naturalists came to visit and walk the trails, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary cougar and her cubs. But Celine, wise as she was, kept her distance from strangers. She returned only once more that summer, standing at the edge of Miriam's field as dusk fell, her now-grown cubs flanking her side. They stared silently, the 4 of them, until the last of the sunlight vanished and the forest embraced them once more. To this day, Miriam says she doesn't fully understand what happened that spring. But one thing she knows for certain: trust is not a given in the wild. It is earned slowly, through stillness, through honoring boundaries, and through showing, without ever needing to say, that your heart means no harm. And sometimes, just sometimes, even the wildest among us can feel that truth.